Hello everyone. Good evening and good afternoon. It's a privilege to have Rob, who has multiple Sitecore MVP awards available here for us to provide on this webinar session to take us through migrating your Sitecore DXP to XM Cloud. On behalf of FUG Chennai, I welcome and thank Rob for agreeing to spend time on this webinar session. I'm also happy to welcome all the audience to this session. Without further ado, Rob, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. So today's topic indeed is migrating your Sitecore DXP to XM Cloud. It's a relatively new topic, XM Cloud not being that long, but we all have a lot of existing Sitecore DXP implementations. And obviously there's a multitude of ways on how to cope with moving to, transferring to, or migrating to XM Cloud. But the architecture is different, so we need to find a way to blend that into our business, and that's what I want to talk about with you today. We're going to have a look at the differences in the architecture and the approach on a cycle project, and not to forget your own architecture, and that not so much that of Sitecore itself. We're going to have a look at the compatibility between the two different types of products, one being the existing XM XP products, now labeled Platform DXP, and the XM Cloud product. We are going to take a look at a typical migration roadmap. Again, disclaimer here, there's a lot of ways to do this. This is only the way that I think is the most viable way if you are not setting up a new implementation alongside, but if you really need to migrate from your existing solution. And we will zoom into custom content resolvers, and I will explain why in a bit. And of course, we have some time for Q&A if you would like. My name is Habraken. I'm a technology director and Sitecore MVP at IO, and I'm working with Sitecore for I think 16 years. A whole lot have changed since that time, and I'm doing quite a lot of implementations, but mostly also advising customers on architecture and coaching teams on implementations. So let's first zoom into the differences of the setup, the architecture, but also very important, the mindset. What makes XM Cloud different from Platform DXP? Well, in a way, it's comparing apples to apples, but there are certain very important differences. The main ones being we're moving from a DXP product, which is all-in-one marketing platform, also including marketing automation, to what I call a powerhouse XM. XM being the CMS only, but it includes way more than that. You also have basic personalization in there. You have a lot of integration possibilities. You have native analytics, which is also beneficial for the new trend of first-party cookies. So it does more than a regular CMS, but it's a new positioning, a new in the landscape of the composable DXP. We have cycle pages, which is an evolution of Horizon or the experience editor, which offers improved editing experience. We do have, well, it's called SaaS, but you still have the PaaS flexibility, which is one thing I like a lot, but there's also a little bit of danger in that, I think. So it's a SaaS product officially, but you're still being able to deploy to it and customize to a certain extent. And I think that's a very important thing to consider when you're designing your architecture. And maybe the most important thing, which I will also use to zoom in on within this talk is that you don't build on top of it anymore, but next to it. I'll explain what that means in a few moments. As I already mentioned, it's part of a composable DXP where integration is key, which means that you now can integrate with a whole lot of products from Sitecore, but also from products outside of the Sitecore scope. And we have a whole new development experience, meaning easier, better, quicker to set up, but also other things to consider when designing your architecture. So to understand the XM Cloud architecture and the things I'm going to talk about, we need to zoom in a bit on what the architecture of XM Cloud itself is. I'm not sure if you have already seen this, but you basically have two environments, your local development environment and XM Cloud. Both are actually provided by Sitecore. The local development environment, you can either fork a starter kit or boilerplate, if you like to call it that, repository that already contains all the configuration containers for you, so you can almost immediately start developing. You only need to download the containers and start them up. You also have a solution in there which you can use to build on, and which you then furthermore maintain and extend from your own repository. And from that self-managed repository, you can also publish to XM Cloud. And XM Cloud actually consists of a few elements. You have the XM Cloud CM instance, which is quite comparable to your former CM instance. You have Edge, and Edge is, it's best to explain as an API to query against for your GraphQL, but it's also a CDN for your media item. You have your rendering host, and the rendering host is actually hosting the, for example, React renderings or Next.js renderings, the TypeScript file. But they are only used to preview and to edit your content. So they are only used for Sitecore pages and for the experience editor. It's not the rendering host being used to view your site. That's a little bit different than what you have when you run local. Then you obviously only view the website via your own rendering host. But in production or in your acceptance or test environment, you have your own self-provided front end running on, for example, Next.js app. And you can select different ways of hosting that. You can use Vercel, you can use your own Azure or AWS hosting to deliver that. And between your front end, your Next.js app, and Edge, there's a GraphQL connection, and that's basically the only thing that you have there. What is important to know is that the rendering host that you see on your right, that's also called the editing host, because it's actually only used for editing purposes. So if you see that terminology, it's the same thing within the XM Cloud space. And one other thing that's important to mention is that you do see a master and a core database, but no longer a web database. That's not being used in XM Cloud. And you will find some traces of that when you go to the desktop. I think you still see something called the web database, and I must say there are some other traces of the quote unquote old product in there, but they're gradually cleaning that up as we speak. So you should know that you only have a master and a core database, despite maybe other signals. And that means something for your publishing behavior, because where you used to publish from master to web with the platform DXP, and that publish actually was a copy from a database master to a database called web, after which upon request, the content got resolved. Now, within Accent Cloud, when you publish from the master database to the edge, and which actually means that a snapshot will be created and placed on your edge. So the publishing works a little bit different. It just stores a snapshot of your data, of your layout data on your CDN. This will also influence a few processes, but we'll take a look at that later on. First, let's compare the architectures, and then not so much the architectures of Sitecore, but the implementation architecture of your own solution built on top of Sitecore. For the platform DXP, a typical approach always has been to what I call layer on top. You would install Sitecore and you would start to put additional things on top of it, into it, if you like. It's one solution. You have multiple projects in your solution. And for us, we use Sitecore for the more complex websites, like booking sites or maybe portals. That means that we always have connections to other systems as well. External IDPs, catalog data for displaying products, or a booking engine for checking availability and booking a product, house, vacation, accommodation, anything. And what we used to do, and I see this as quite a typical implementation, is that we put those data integrations into our solution built on Sitecore, with the business logic also being in there. Additionally, visitor identification and tracking, personalization, and all that other stuff also happened in this layer by Sitecore. But we used to insert our own data integrations here as well, because we could then quite easily merge that external provided data to into the content coming from Sitecore. So the React frontend app, which in our case most of the times has been React for over the past few years, a React.js app. You would merge that content, and the React.js app wouldn't know if the content is coming from Sitecore or from the external data provider. For example, if you have a holiday accommodation that you want to book, you see the images and the content describing the home within Sitecore content, but the availability and the prices would come from external data sources. And on top of that, we also had the habit of customizing stuff when we needed to, which made Sitecore really a part, and that's the blue dotted line, making Sitecore part of your own implementation. So your own development domain includes Sitecore. And I think that is something that we need to change. This makes updating more difficult, but it's also a less transparent architecture, if you like. When you go to Accent Cloud, you want to have a change of perspective. You want to introduce separation of concern. And I must say, and maybe you'll have been doing this for quite some time, because it was perfectly possible with the old product as well. Again, old, it's not old because it's still there and it's still being developed on, so I shouldn't use that term, but I should say platform DXP. By the way, we also still use, next to Accent Cloud, we still use platform DXP for new development, depending on the exact requirements. So the platform DXP product also allowed for this implementing this architecture, but most of the times we didn't do it like that. With Accent Cloud, you actually have to. What you see is that you see and I'll explain what you see in a bit, but what you see is a better separation of concern, a cleaner architecture, maybe a shift of ownership of what your own development domain is. And it's going to be easier to maintain, and it's going to be, I think, easier and more fun to work on. So what have I done? I have moved all of the integrations, and I moved them over to my own microservices. So what I wanted to do is I want to have separate microservices for all the integrations that I have, like the catalog data and the booking engine. And I'm going to retrieve data from those microservices and store data via those microservices coming from my Next.js app, coming from the front end. Because of Sitecore mostly publishing static data, you want to move your integrations and your functionality to the head. Obviously, you can do this in multiple ways, but this is just a simplified view. A visitor would hit the Next.js app, and you would acquire the layout from the edge server. That's the layout snapshot. If you need additional data from Sitecore, you just query content using the GraphQL API, which actually means that your own implementation is now architecturally separated from Sitecore implementation, which also is one of the reasons Sitecore is now able to upgrade more easily, because it's not intertwined with your own solution. But it also makes CI/CD processes, development, delivery, it all makes it way more agile, and I think it's a great, and that's a great innovation. So that on the change of perspective of your architecture. And depending on what you use from the product, you want to also know what is compatible between the platform DXP and between XM Cloud. So what's compatible and what isn't. I've made a few overviews of the different things. Some are quite obvious, but still, if you want a complete overview, I think it's good to mention. On the left side, and this is the functional list, so not the technical list. I have listed the XP functionality. If you look at XConnect and XDB, and all of the marketing applications like the experience analytics, the marketing control panel, FXM, the path analyzer, they're all not in XM Cloud anymore, and you should use or migrate to our Sitecore Personalize and or Sitecore CDP, depending on what you need. If you have existing personalization rules, you want to move to implementing those with Sitecore Personalize, though you might not need the actual product Sitecore Personalize because XM Cloud already contains, let's say, a subset of the functionality of Personalize, which is, by the way, also exactly the same. So if you in the future need to upgrade to the personalized product itself, you would not have to change anything to your solution. So basic in-session personalization is embedded in XM Cloud. But you need to redo your rules because they are set up differently. We'll see that as part of our roadmap in a bit. The email experience manager is no longer there, and you want to use Sitecore Send for that, or an equal product. Sitecore Forms is not available in XM Cloud as well, which would be one of the reasons to, for now, leverage the platform DXP. Or you would want to use a third-party product. But I know, and that's what I've heard on SubCon, is that Sitecore is working on a new edition of Forms that is compatible with XM Cloud. So I think, not sure when, but still within 2023, I think we will see something change here. And the last one is Sitecore Identity, which is now been replaced by Sitecore Unified Identity. but that's mostly or only targeted on creating a unified identification process between the different composable products. So it's not used for the front end. What we have done, and I think a lot of Sitecore implementations have done that, is reuse the Sitecore roles and permissions within Sitecore to connect them up via Sitecore identity to external identity providers. So you can steer on what people see coming from certain roles and stuff, but that's you need the CD role for that, and it's no longer there, so you can't actually access that. You only want to use Sitecore Unified Identity for a Sitecore login into the client. If you do need to pair up the permissions within Sitecore, you would have to go via the front end. So you would, for example, include claims into your content structure and use graph to query the specific content that's allowed for a certain identity when you have your identity provider. But you would, if you have a custom IDP, you would connect it up, as I've shown in a few slides back, from the front end, not via Sitecore. And then we have a technical overview on what has changed. And well, SXA is still persistent. It's, by the way, a prominent, it plays a prominent role in your new content structure. But a few things are no longer available. Obviously, SXA with MVC, because XM Cloud is purely headless. And SXA search components, and you would need to use Sitecore search for that or similar. And what happened to search is also quite interesting, because just like the Sitecore identity I mentioned, we had also a habit of using custom search indexes to crawl or search through content on our website and implement a search functionality. You can't do that any longer because you don't have custom search indexes. But you can use Sitecore search as a separate product for that, or for simple use cases, you can use GraphQL search queries. And I will show you a few examples at the end of this presentation. Again, obviously, MVC renderings are no longer supported because it's only GSS, and all other things that are related to tracking uses, like the universal tracker, device detection, and IP geolocation, are now no longer supported, and you should use CDP for that to implement. And the last two things, actually quite good news: the Sitecore publishing service and the update center are actually no longer needed. You have built-in publishing that works a little bit different, as I showed you, and the update center is no longer needed because Sitecore will keep your instance up to date. And the cool thing, I think, about XM Cloud is that it will not only keep your XM Cloud instance up to date, but also your development environment, because Sitecore is able to put new images on their registry, on their image registry, and or container registry. So when you're working on something locally and you shut down your containers and you continue next week and you start up your containers, you might already have an updated instance, and it does that for you. So I think it's quite brilliant. It saves you a lot of work and hassle. So I've summarized this all in a kind of a comparison chart. Quickly going over that, basic personalization analytics, that's an XM Cloud. So you're good, you don't need any other product, but you can't reuse your previous rules, so you have to re-implement them. All the advanced personalization, marketing, automation, and profiling should be redesigned using personalized and CDP. Search functionality should be replaced by Sitecore Search, EXM by Sitecore Send. Your MVC renderings, if you still have them, you need to migrate to GSS. And anything other like publishing, deploying, or updating, all the technical stuff is being taken care of by XM Cloud. what does that mean for your roadmap? As I said, this is a typical migration project as I see it when you move from DXP to Accent Cloud. I have divided the process in 4 different chapters, and I will go into detail on each of them in a bit. But first, let's go over the steps. It all starts with the assessment. You need a gap analysis of what the differences are, a breakdown of your customizations because they might not apply anymore, and you need to plan your migration. Then you're going to prepare in transforming your architecture on your current setup. So what that means is that you're going to change the things that are not compatible, but you can do that when still on your current setup. You don't actually have to migrate first, or maybe you don't want to do that first. And then depending on the gap that you have, rework your front end and adapt to the new way of content distribution, and you might need to introduce a new front-end framework. Obviously, if you're coming from an MVC, this is going to be a bigger step. If you're already on GSS, it's going to be easier. And if you're already on SXA and GSS, it's going to be quite a breeze. But again, it really depends on your customizations that you have done. The last step then would be the migration. So as you see, I would do a lot of preparation steps and then start migrating the new implementation. Or migrating, which means you start with the implementation of your new Accent Cloud and you start migrating all the data over, which should then be compatible by that time. And I've drawn an imaginary line of indicating the complexity, impact, and the workload over time to show that I think that the most work should or will probably be transforming your own architecture and then reworking your front end, or obviously depending on your solution. The migration itself should be that difficult because it's still Sitecore. You can still reuse your content and all of your layouts. And if you have fairly basic solution, there's not a lot of changes in there. So let's do a little bit of a deep dive here. As I said, you would start out with an assessment, taking inventory. And that focuses mostly around your customizations. So any customizations to the CMS, custom fields, for example, custom editing fields. Important thing to mention here, you still have your content editor, you still have your experience editor. And in those, your custom field editors will work, but you also have pages, and that's what you want to focus on. But in pages, it's not yet possible in a very clean way or an official way to change the behavior of the editing components. So if you have any customizations on other field types or integrations, retrieving data from external sources, displaying them in the editing part of the CMS, you might want to have a closer look at that. And furthermore, the more default content resolvers and render pipelines should be looked at. You should make a list of all your integrations and how they are embedded, and the same for your personalization rules. And then for the gap analysis, you would want to know on which Sitecore version you are and if you want to upgrade. And here it also goes that, well, I'll show you a good point for your upgrade in the next slide. But you should know where you start out from and where you're heading to. And also, how much do you leverage the XP or the non-functionality? That's going to be a major influence. If you don't have a lot of marketing automation plans, it's going to be easier. Otherwise, you need to redesign those. and obviously if you are already using GFS or not. And then the last step is to isolate or plan to isolate and refactor components in preparation of the migration. So the next step would be the preparation. And I also refer to this process as carving out the functionality and the integrations from where you don't want them to be, and put them in the right place for your future architecture. So you would move out any business logic and place them in microservices or other composable products. And also you want to move your integration touch points toward the front end. And then when you're ready, you want to upgrade to the latest version of Sitecore before making the jump to XM Cloud. And this is interesting because, well, let's for example, take a custom Solr search solution. You have your custom indexes. You maintain your own Solr instances, which is going to cost you maintenance and time to keep everything up and running. And it's also custom business logic within your Sitecore. All of that not being compatible with XM Cloud, so you want to do something with that. What you can do in a composable world that we have right now is you can start using Sitecore Search or comparable products, but you can use Sitecore Search on your current solution already. So what you could do is first start replacing your search functionality in your website with Sitecore Search. When you have done that, you can remove your Solr instance, or at least your custom work on it, because Sitecore still needs Solr, of course, to work. You can remove your custom Solr implementation. You can remove your custom indexes, your business logic, and by doing so, you actually would make your Sitecore implementation more lean and smaller. And that means that the upgrade will also be easier. So I would choose to first do the carve out and then start upgrading my solution. And it also goes, if I ever go back, how much do you leverage XP, like the marketing automation stuff? The same goes for that. If you want to already start using personalized, which is already moved to the front end, you can use that product on your current solution, and you can remove all the current personalization rules and replace them with time to personalize, for example, the custom profiles with CDP and so forth. So that would mean that you don't have like a big bang migration, but you are going to gradually replace stuff with composable products and then slowly start moving towards your XM Cloud solution. For the front end, you would want to drop your custom rendering pipelines because they are no longer applicable. And your custom content resolvers all need a good look at, because they might be still applicable. They might still be functional, but it really depends on your use case. And I have a whole lot of slides for that as well to show you exactly what. So you need to determine the purpose of those and rethink or redesign them. And then, depending on the delta of your front end, you either want to develop new renderings or rework them to fit your new GraphQL content output. And you can, by the way, if you're not using SXA and you're on your own Helix structure, you can perfectly well keep your renderings as long as you're already working adequately. And the last step is setting up a new solution. I like to use the repository and fork it, and I like that better than using the wizard on the XM Cloud portal, because I'm more in control of what happens. And I think the CLI is a little bit more flexible for me as a developer to work with. You want to update your NuGet feed to XM Cloud references, and then you start to configure your build configuration. You can configure your item serialization over there, the projects that you still want to build and move into XM Cloud, and need to be built by XM Cloud, by the way. That's also in this XM Cloud build JSON file, and the rendering or editing hosts, and any other XDT transform you require. That's all in that one configuration file. You want to use, if you're not already using it, of course, you want to configure Sitecore content serialization. If you're working with Unicorn or TDS, that's where you want to go. I think Unicorn can still work, but PSC is native to the platform, and it's really optimized for containerized use, so it's working fast and reliable. And then reapply your personalization rules based on your new design. Obviously, if you've already done that in an earlier step, you can skip that, and design and implement your new CI/CD pipelines. And that's what the migration process basically is. It's going to be a long road for the more complex solutions. And obviously, you can also opt to just start a new implementation on XM Cloud right away and start implementing stuff on there, and use a reverse proxy to switch between your platform DXP and XM Cloud. That's also perfectly possible if you are if you are using, and that's what we do for a few customers as well. If you have an implementation with the desire to redesign the front end anyway, if you have an implementation that needs new page types, or you want to refresh the design, and you have a big step to make coming from, for example, MVC, you can also consider to set up a parallel XM Cloud solution and start working in there, and gradually moving pages over using the reverse proxy, as long as you're running in a hybrid mode. So this is not the only way, but it shows you an approach on migrating a project that's already quite compatible to XM Cloud. So with all of this comes a new development experience. And I think I already mentioned this, the development experience is way better. You don't spend a whole lot of time on setting up Sitecore, creating your solution. It's just there already. And it's also way easier to share with your colleagues because everything is containerized. Also with CSC, you can push content towards each environment, and the XM Cloud environment is already set up. So your CI/CD pipeline is not going to be a whole lot more complex than the same CLI commands do. I know I didn't show you that, but because this talk isn't about how to use XM Cloud, but how to migrate to it. But yeah, you basically have a CLI command to do a deployment to XM Cloud, and you have your content serialization, and that's what your pipeline is going to look like. So in many ways, I feel the development experience is better, also because your own implementations are going to run on separate nodes in your architecture, your microservices, your front end. So those applications are smaller, more lean, and making you more agile. You have more control over those, and it's easier to deploy and maintain, release all of those components in your architecture. But when you work with XM Cloud, you have different ways of operating. You have different ways of operating. You can run what they call fully local, and that means you check out the repository I've mentioned. You get a bunch of containers, of which the most important ones are the rendering host and the CM. The other are just, well, supplying info for the others to work with. It's not something you're working on. But the CM is your point of contact to create data templates, create layouts, go into the editor. and the rendering host is where you put your files on. Now, if you do this, it's working quite brilliantly. You have your renderings locally, and you can just, it automatically hot reloads those renderings into your containers. You can use Sitecore serialization to sync your content into the CM, and you can deploy your own foundation. If you change anything to the Sitecore project, you can deploy that to the containers as well. And the thing is, it is targeted at backend developers because you need to run Windows containers, and that's not possible when you have a Mac. And there's one more downside of this. You can't test your work on Sitecore pages. I know there is a setting in Sitecore pages that you can use to point towards your local development environment and use that. But I have mixed experiences with the reliability of that. And it also makes the workflow a little bit more complex. But in general, when you use this method, you don't have immediate access to Sitecore pages, but because that only runs in Sitecore XM Cloud. So you have to deploy to your XM Cloud environment to test pages. And the second mode is the Edge mode. And this is targeted at front-end developers mainly, or people working on a Mac. And it's a little bit more of a difficult overview because you now have, on the left hand, you have the same source repository. I would use a single repository for the front-end and backend because your renderings also need to be deployed to Sitecore, so they need to be in the right folder structure. But you also have your Next.js dev server probably. You're not running your containers because that's not something you can do because you're on a Mac. But the brilliant thing of XM Cloud is you can actually query content against Edge directly from your local environment. So you can connect up to XM Cloud and you don't need anything else for your local development environment. Though you have a dependency on your backend developers for what I call item preparation. So you can't do a local creation of a data template inside for of the layout definition item and publish them to XM Cloud. Although there is a way to do that if you want, because if you're running XM Cloud, you actually at least have in the smallest tier license, you have one production environment and two non-production environments. And you can choose to use one of those non-production environments as your kind of default development environment and query against that from your front end. And so you can also use that one to create your data templates in. But you need to be sure that you use Sitecore content serialization to pull out those changes and sync them to your disk to push them to the repository. I think it's a good thing when you start a new project on XM Cloud to have a sit down with your front-end and back-end developers and look at this and your workflow to determine what the best way for you is to work with. If you're going to utilize the XM Cloud for your development environment, depending on whether you're not using Mac for the front enders, it makes it for a different scenario, and it's good to be aligned on that before you start. And then we have the workflow that comes from that. If you don't use the development environment on XM Cloud, you would probably have a backend or Sitecore developer creating templates and renderings items, committing that as separate from the front end, deploying it to make sure it lands on XM Cloud. And you can use the CLI on your local development machine, but I would prefer a CI pipeline for that. And then you have your front-end developer that can start querying against XM Cloud, working on the renderings and commit those changes and deploy again. And only then you can test your work. depending on what you decide with the development modes, this is also going to change or be influenced. That's a good thing to have a look at. And then the last topic for today is the custom content resolvers, because as I said, we all have a habit of customizing our content resolvers. And I think now you want to shift towards utilizing GraphQL. And the asterisk is because you don't need to in all cases. So the first question is, can you still use custom content resolvers? Well, the answer is yes. But there's a change in when they are resolved. So as I've shown you, that Platform DXP is publishing from the master to the web. And then at request time, the content is resolved. Now, with XM Cloud, the content is actually resolved at publish time. So your content resolvers are not going to be impacted by cache invalidation, and you can't do dynamic data retrieval. Because if you used to, well, the example I gave you, if you have a booking engine and you have availability, and you're going to merge that within your content resolver with data coming from Sitecore and data coming from an external data source, that's not going to work, because the availability, if it would work technically, which is also not the case, I'll show you, the content would be static. So that's not something you can do. And this is one more reason why you want to move your or push your integrations to the front end or to the head of your application, and not keeping them within Sitecore. But this also means something for the content resolvers that you built in the past. So should you still use your content resolvers, your custom content resolvers? Well, you have two options. You can transfer your custom content resolvers to XM Cloud, but only if they produce static data. And the other option is to restructure your content and use out-of-the-box content resolvers, which is actually preferred, because you have less functionality to maintain, less code to test and maintain, and your application is going to be more agile, easier to upgrade. So actually it's preferred to not use custom content resolvers a lot. You have a number of them out of the box. You have your data source and your content context item resolvers, both the item itself or children of them, and you have your filter resolver that you can use for descendants or for filtering on, for example, certain types. So why do we use custom content resolvers? I think it's also a good thing to look at why we did this and why we need them, so we can design a new process around it. Well, first reason why we do use them is I think Sitecore also pushed on using them. There's examples on the documentation sites on how to customize them, and we used it to restructure data a lot. We used it to change field names, to comply with front-end structure, to simplify the data model, also for ease of content, restructuring content, like combining items or changing the hierarchy or creating hierarchy. We have used it to reorder content, sorting and filtering, and the including dynamic data like the booking data or product data, and sometimes even to perform additional operations automatically within the content resolvers. I show you an example of that. And if you then look at what is still possible and what not, you will see that anything dynamically, like including dynamic data and performing additional operations, is no longer possible. The other things might still be possible, but you can also use alternative ways of achieving the same result with less code better maintenance, and easier to test. And that's either going to be a GraphQL query, or just, for example, when restructuring content was done in the content resolvers, why not restructure the content in Sitecore itself? And it forces you into using a certain content structure in Sitecore, but it also removes a lot of complexity from your implementation. So I have a few examples. These are, but you might want to reconsider moving them either to graph queries or restructuring the content, because, well, it's easier to maintain. It's less code, less functionality into your solution. And you want, and that's, I think, one of the base thoughts when looking at Action Cloud, that it's you don't want a lot of customizations, and stay close to the product. So I have brought a few examples, which is all like a little bit of pseudo code, because it's grabbed from actual projects but changed a little bit here and there. But it just shows you what I've encountered when looking at when I was actually doing this assessment, this gap analysis myself, to see what customizations do we have. And I found this one where we actually are, this is something for wildcard pages that do not actually exist in Sitecore, and we still wanted to count the number of visits. So we've created something within the content resolver that whenever someone pulls the content from the content resolver, it automatically counts the visit, which is cool from a developer perspective, but it's no longer possible, partly because this code is heavily XDB connected, or it's not applicable in Action Cloud anymore, but mostly because this dynamic stuff doesn't work. So you want to split off this functionality and put it in a separate microservice, probably connecting to CDP or any other analytics tool, and then call that from the front end. This is also a nice one, a content resolver. This is not an explanation on how to do it, just what I encountered. And I found this funny as well, because we're actually passing a query string parameter with an ID to actually influence the data we get back from the content resolver with the button text or URL. And this is obviously something you want to move towards your head, the whole of this functionality. So you can absolutely get the data for the button, but if you want to do customizations on that data, just do it in the front end, because you will already have the business ID over there, so you just need to move it. And if you have any adjacent micros or logic, business logic around it that doesn't belong in the front end, then you put it in a microservice. This is also a fun example, because this is actually from this Sitecore documentation website. And this content resolver is an example on how to do content resolvers, custom ones. And this actually still works, but the outcome is maybe not what you expect, because it says datetime.now, and this will not give you the date of the request, but the date of the publish, because it's already been resolved, and it's only resolved once. And then the breadcrumbs. I found this one, there's more logic behind it. What it does, we have a breadcrumb resolver, and it resolves and it creates a breadcrumb path. And this would actually still work. But, and as I said, there's more code behind this breadcrumb type resolver. This is a lot more code than you actually need when you do it the GraphQL way. So what you might want to do is create a query for this kind of stuff. Because within GraphQL, you can also, with the has layout true parameter, you can filter on navigable pages, and you can filter on certain data templates. So you can perfectly say, I want all the ancestors going leading up to my current item with a specific template ID, so I can build up my breadcrumb. So you can see, apart from the layout node that's resolved when you hit a page, you can also do additional queries to get this. And I think this is easier to maintain than actual custom C# code doing the same thing. And you can do more stuff with GraphQL search queries. You can filter, for example, for facet thing, if you select all the content nodes with of a certain category, or you can search on field values if you, for example, want to find all the items with the term cloud in the title. That will work as well. But GraphQL does have limitations because you can't recursively search, and there's you can only search to content. So if you want to build by full crawlers, or if you want to incorporate more complex data or do things like recursive search, then you might want to use Sitecore Search for that as a separate product. But looking at your custom content resolvers, bottom line is try to use the default ones like the data source resolver and the context item resolvers, and try to use GraphQL queries to search for additional content or items. And only if your current custom content resolvers produce static output, you can still use Dynamics in Cloud if you want, if you're looking at a migration. So the conclusion, the lessons learned of this whole process is that you want to move out your customizations first, isolate your business logic into microservices, and then transfer your integrations to the front end. All of this leads up to revisioning your content structure and your content resolving, and depending on where you are right now, either reusing your JSS renderings or migrating towards it. And if you think the delta is too big, you can also opt for a gradual transition or a hybrid setup where you have two implementations alongside each other. So there's a lot of ways to do this, but I hope I've given you some ideas on how to cope with this kind of projects and how to plan on going forward with them. If you do so, I really do think you end up with a better overall architecture with a higher level of separation and easier and integrations and future integrations are going to be way easier, also supported by the shift in your development domain. And the most important one, you have less maintenance and no upgrades, so you can add more business value. And by that, I want to thank you for your attention and want to ask you if you have any questions, but I'm not sure we have a whole lot of people left, so I'm going to stop my sharing the screen, and maybe we can have a chat on this topic with the people left in. And I promise to also do a recording in the future, so we have one back to front cohesion talk instead of this cut up thing. Do you have any questions, or shall we call it a day and go forward with our work today?
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I think you can share the recording with us. I really apologize for the technical difficulties which came up at the last moment before the meeting could be concluded. Let me try to work out with the provider and try to get this resolved. Okay.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I'll also look at alternatives if possible to make the meetings much smoother related.
No problem at all.
Yeah.
It's something you don't have any influence on. we'll cope with the technical difficulties, no problem at all. I understand. Thanks for having me. And well, you can always reach out to me if you like on Twitter or Slack or my website. Well, if you are at the point of migrating towards XM Cloud, I would love to hear your experiences and ideas on that topic as well. So I'm always happy to chat about this topic. Thanks for your attention and have a nice day.
Thanks for this session.
Yeah.
Thank
it was
you.
very detailed and informative. Thank you. Have a nice day and rest of the evening. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Rob.